Quite a few people ask about 64mm versus 69mm valves with 139 QMB, the GY650 engines. So for this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly it means to have 64 or 69mm valves and differences in the head and how you can tell which one you have. So let's start by seeing what we're talking about when we say 64 or 69mm valves. And that's actually very simple. Here I've got a 64mm valve, and here is a 69mm valve. And as you can see, the 64mm valve is shorter than the 69mm valve. And if I measure these out, the 64mm valve is roughly 64 millimeters long, and of course the 69mm valve is roughly 69 millimeters long. So that's all you're talking about when you're saying 64 or 69mm valves. That's what you're actually talking about, the length of the valve itself. And here I've got 64 and 69mm valves, both intake valves, laid side by side, and you can see they're the same diameter. So if you have 64 or 69mm valves, that doesn't mean that one has an actual larger valve diameter. You're not going to get more performance out of it that way. So now how do we tell if the scooter or head has 64 or 69mm valves? Well, obviously from what I've showed you, you could take the valves out and measure them, but that's not really necessary. If the head happens to be disassembled, you don't have a camshaft or rocker assembly on it, it's actually quite easy to tell just by looking at the intake valve and its seat. This is a 64mm valved head, and this is a 69mm valved head. If you look at the 64mm head, you can see that down there at the seat of the spring, it's actually cut away and the seat sits deep in the head there. And then if you look at the 69mm valved head, you can see that the seat and the spring is raised up out of the head. You've got extra aluminum here. And I'll zoom in to get you a closer look at both. So here's a look at the 64mm head, and you can see on the intake side, it's easier to look at the intake, by the way, because your exhaust side has this little barrier here. So on the intake side, you can see that the valve seat, it's cut down here, and you don't really have much material rising up above the base here. And then here's a closer look at a 69mm head, and if you look down at the base of the intake spring, you can see that there's a bunch of material here raised up above the surface of the head. You're still using the same springs on 64 and 69mm heads, but they sit up higher because of this in the 69mm heads. Now that method is very easy if you happen to have the camshaft and the rocker assembly out, but here on an assembled engine with just the valve cover off, you can see there's a lot in your way, and it's not quite so easy to get a look down there at the valve seats. You can get a look down there, but as you can see, it's a lot harder to be confident with what you're looking at compared to when the rocker assembly and camshaft aren't in place. The most common method is to try and look straight across the top of the head, obviously with the valve cover off. And if you look on the left, this is a 64mm valved head, and on the right, this is a 69mm valved head. And hopefully what you can see is that on the 64mm valved head, the spring and the spring retainer here are sunken down into the head more, whereas on the 69mm valved head, the spring and spring retainer are more visible above the valve cover surface of the head here. It's fairly evident which is which when you've got them sitting right next to each other, because I can clearly see that this valve is sitting up higher than this valve, so I know this must be the 69mm valved head. Unfortunately, if you don't have two heads sitting side by side, it may be a little more difficult to judge. This is a close-up of a 69mm valved head, and one thing that makes it a little easier to tell is that you can see here, the very top piece is the valve spring retainer. You can see that this valve spring retainer on the 69mm head actually comes up above the valve cover sealing area here, the valve cover surface. And if you're still not sure just by looking at it, you can take something like a ruler, lay it across there, and when I slide it up against the valve spring, I can see that the retainer and even part of the spring is actually a little bit above my ruler. Now here's a shot of a 64 millimeter valved head, and you can see that the edge of this retainer here actually comes down a little bit below the valve cover sealing area. And if you're not sure, again, you can take something flat like this ruler here, slide it over, and I can see now that the retainer is actually below my ruler here on the very edge. And this is another look from a different angle at the 64 millimeter head. And again, if I put my ruler right on this flat surface here, slide it over a bit, you can see that my ruler will actually go over the edge of the spring retainer here. And again, if I move the 69 millimeter valved head over here, do the same thing, then you can see the retainer is actually sitting above my ruler. Before you try to check this on an assembled engine, you will need to make sure that the camshaft is in the proper position so that the valve springs are uncompressed here. Because if your springs are compressed down and your valves are being pressed down by your rocker assembly and camshaft, then you can't really tell how tall the valve springs are or where they sit. So you want to rotate the engine and look at these 3 holes on your camshaft. You'll have a large hole here and then 2 small holes. The large hole should be at the top here facing forward, facing the front of the engine or towards the front of the scooter. And these 2 small holes should be parallel with the surface that your valve cover gasket sits on, or that your valve cover sits on. And if it's aligned there, both valves should be closed, and that way you can get an accurate measurement. And then once I know that my valves are closed, I can look across here and I can actually see that this retainer is sitting above this sealing surface here for the valve cover. And if I couldn't, again, I can stick the ruler down there, and once I stick the ruler on the valve cover surface, I can see that the retainer is definitely above the ruler. So this does work when your engine is assembled. One way that people claim you can find out if you have 64 or 69 millimeter valves is by looking at your engine code, which is down here on the side of the engine. It's just below the CVT cover. You can see it's near your oil drain plug. And what they say is, a lot of times, if you have the 1P39 QMB, that means you have 69 millimeter valves, and if you don't have the P code engine, then you have 64 millimeter valves. Unfortunately, that's not true, because there are engines that have a P code and have 64 millimeter valves, so you can forget that. Now you may be wondering why it really matters if you have 64 or 69 millimeter valves. The reason it matters for most people is because they're replacing their cylinder head for some reason. Usually that's with a big bore kit or something happened to their original cylinder head, so they need to replace it. Now you can use either head on any engine. The bottom end of both should be essentially the same. Where you run into problems is you have to match the rocker assembly here with the head and the valve spring length. If you look here, this is a 64 millimeter head with a 64 millimeter rocker assembly. And if you look here, you can see that your rocker arms have a little tip on them, and they meet up with the end of the valve stem there. And those need to meet up exactly at the right angle and align with each other properly. And here I've got a 69 millimeter valved head with a 64 millimeter rocker assembly on it. And what I've had to do is screw this piece out more, because initially the rocker arm was actually running into the retainer here. But you can see, even with it screwed out more, they're not meeting at the proper angle here. Hopefully you can tell there's a big gap on this side where the valve stem meets compared to this side, so you're really only getting contact on one side there. And you want these to meet at the appropriate angle so there's as much contact as possible and centered on each other. And that can't happen if you try to use a 69 millimeter head with 64 millimeter rockers, or if you try to use a 64 millimeter head with 69 millimeter rockers. You have to match the rockers to the valve length. If you need rocker arms to match, you've got a couple of options. The first is to buy this entire assembly, and then all you have to do is swap it out in place of your old one. The other option is to replace only the rocker arms and keep the rest of the stock assembly. Sometimes big bore kits will actually include different rocker arms with their kit so that you can swap them out. If not, you can buy them separately. If you do decide to replace just the arms and not the entire assembly, if you turn it the right way, you can see the ends of a couple of pins from one side, and those go through the rocker arm. So all you have to do is basically turn it so that the pins are facing down, and you'll have to tap on it, and you should be able to get the pins out that way. And once you pull a pin out, then you can remove the rocker arm. You put the new one back in place, and then slide the pin back through the rocker arm until it's all the way in. Repeat the same for both sides, same kind of deal, and then you'd be okay with your new rocker arms. And finally, I wanted to cover one more thing about 64 and 69 millimeter valved heads that I don't think most people would be aware of, because probably most people aren't like me and buy heads and cut them in half just to check them out. So here, I've got a 64 millimeter valved head that I cut in half, and here is a 69 millimeter valved head that I cut in half, and I tried to go right down the center of the ports. Now this is a close-up of the 64 millimeter valved head, and what we're looking at here is the intake port. And if you look right here at the bottom of the valve seat area, between there and the roof of the intake port, you have next to no room there. I measured it out, and it's about 1.5 millimeters, I believe, on this one. So for anybody that wants to port a head, you could run into some real trouble if you try to get very aggressive at all, or if you're just trying to smooth it out. You could actually cut right through there and end up messing up your cylinder head. And if you look over at the exhaust, on this one there happens to be a little bit more room, but it was still only a little over 2 millimeters of clearance there. So again, if you were getting aggressive at all, you could end up cutting right through there and ruining your cylinder head if you were trying to do port work. Now this is the 69 millimeter head, and if you look here, this is again the intake port. If you look at the very base of the valve seat here, and then the area between there and the top of the intake port, you can see you've got a lot more room than you did over with the 64 millimeter head. And on both of these, intake and exhaust, you can see they're both the same way. They've both got a lot more room. They both came out at, I believe it was 5 to 6 millimeters of clearance that I had on either one of those between the roof of the port and the base here for the valve springs. So if you were porting a head, you actually might be in better shape if you were to use a head that had 69 millimeter valves, because you've got a lot more meat here up above the port, and you're so much less likely. Most people aren't going to cut so aggressively that they cut out, say, 4 to 5 millimeters of material and cut all the way through. Where on the other hand, over here, you could easily cut out a millimeter or so of material and end up breaking through there. So that won't matter to most people, but if you happen to be looking at getting into a porting project, and maybe you wanted to raise the roof of the port or something like that, you might actually be better off to convert over to a 69 millimeter valved head. Now, whether this is true for the aftermarket heads that have different sizes or different lengths of valves, I can't tell you for sure, but these are both stock heads, and you can see there's quite a difference in the 69 millimeter valved head and again over to the 64 millimeter valved head and how much material you've got left there. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope it was helpful. If it was, please like it, favorite, and subscribe for more.